like to live on the periphery of boundaries. And they like to break boundaries between things because interesting things happen when you think a different way, when you think outside of the box, so to speak. That's what open people do. They always think outside of the box, no matter what box you put them in. You know, and sometimes you meet people that are so open that they're completely disorganized. Their thought process is almost completely associational, like a dreamer. They just jump from one thing to another. And they're very interesting to talk to. It's very hard for those people to get their lives together because they're interested in absolutely everything and their attention just flits all over the place. And so they're open, and that actually does go along with higher intelligence, generally speaking. So, and then if they're low in conscientiousness, they don't see any utility in order. And order, like orderly people, because that's part of conscientiousness and the biggest determiner of political belief in the conscientious domain, the orderly people like to have everything in its separate place and properly structured. And so, you know, their world is box, inside a shelf of boxes, and then that shelf of boxes is inside another box, and all those boxes are nice and neat and tight, nothing inside them is touching, and everything in every box is the same thing. And you know, you can see you can see the utility in that, and that, as far as we've been able to tell, is also associated with disgust sensitivity. And people are disgusted, generally speaking, when things that shouldn't be touching are touching, like something horrible stuck to you, for example. That produces a very visceral sense of disgust. And it's a boundary violation, because that's what disgust is. It indexes a boundary violation. And how separate people should be from one another as individuals or in groups is an entirely debatable issue. Because there's huge advantages when people mingle and mix, and there's huge dangers when people mingle and mix. And so at some point you say, well, the dangers are overwhelming the positives, and at another point you say, well, the positives are overwhelming the dangers, and you have a continual argument about that with yourself, but more importantly with people who have different temperament than you. You know, and the terrible temptation is to assume that only those people who have your temperament are correct. And that's just, those other temperaments wouldn't exist if that was true. I mean, if you look at it from, just say if you look at it from a strictly biological perspective. So anyways, one of the things we do to simplify the world is to frame it physically. And so you look at this, you've got wall number 1, and then you have wall number 2. But then inside the walls, you have walls around everything. All these houses are walls, and inside the houses, there are walls as well. And so everything is, and what you do when you put walls around things is you make part of the world simpler, right? Constantly. If the reason you have a house is so that everybody and his dog isn't in your house. You just want those few people that you can barely tolerate in your house. And not all those other strangers, and God only knows what they're going to do. You'll still invite people in now and then, because maybe you're sick and tired and bored of the people that are in your house, and so you want a little bit of new information. But you want those barriers to be there so that you can voluntarily modulate the information flow. Okay, so that's the first thing you do. And you know, then you set up rules with everybody else. It says, well, I'm going to have some walls so you can't come in, but what I'm going to do is pay you for that privilege by letting you have some walls where people can't come in. And so I think that's analogous. I was thinking about the issue of discrimination in relationship to sex, because I've been thinking a lot about discrimination lately, because everybody thinks discrimination is a bad idea, which is a very stupid proposition, because you're discriminating all the time. And the most fundamental form of discrimination is choice of sexual partner. And so you might say, well, why should that even be allowed? Because it is the most fundamental form of discrimination. So for example, almost everyone is racially prejudiced when it comes to sexual partners. So you think, well, is that right? What about, do you use age as an exclusionary criteria? Probably. Do you use physical attractiveness? Only insofar as you're able, right? You use it completely if you could get away with it, roughly speaking, but you can't, because the most attractive people aren't going to be anywhere near you. So you can't do it, but you'd like to. Health, yes. Strength, yes. Wealth, yes. Education, definitely. So it's unbelievably discriminatory. And so you might say, well, why is that justifiable? And it seems to me that it's something like, well, you get to say no to me if I get to say no to you. It's something like that. We've agreed that everybody gets to discriminate on that basis, and because everybody can do it, then it's fair. It's something like that. It's very much worth thinking about. You know, I don't know if you know this, but in Huxley's book, Brave New World, where the family had been completely demolished, right, and children were conceived in bottles and given and produced in factories. So the whole idea of the relationship between sex and procreation had become a taboo. One of the mantras, the slogans of the society was, everyone belongs to everyone else. And so it was actually a social faux pas to refuse to sleep with someone, just as it was a social faux pas to have any exclusionary relationship. Because another thing that you might notice is that there's nothing more discriminatory than falling in love with someone. It's like, you're special, and all the rest of you? No. So it's the ultimate exclusionary act, right? And yet we presume that that's an acceptable, not only acceptable, we demand that as a right. And, well, that's worth thinking about a lot. Anyways, okay, so what you're doing is, by agreeing to this segregation and boxing, what you're doing is carving off little bits of the world that are simple enough so that someone like you can live for some amount of time there without too much danger. And everyone agrees to do that, roughly speaking, because everybody needs to engage in that process of simplification and safety provision. And so we have towns, and the towns are nothing but boxes, but inside boxes. So there's a good, a good schematic of a little house, and you can see that even inside the same place we segregate off rooms for different purposes. And then what's interesting too is that we set up those rooms as little dramatic spaces, right? So you furnish them, and you furnish them with things that tell you how to behave in that room. So a table and chairs tells you that's where you're going to eat, and that's where people are going to sit, and they're going to sit facing each other. That has certain implications because the chairs don't face the walls, they face each other. And you have a living room where it's comfortable and there's a fire, and you're setting up little stages basically, so that just like kids do when they pretend, they all assign each other roles, and then they lay out a little drama. And that's what you do when you invite someone over. Well, let's sit in the living room. Well, you'll probably get a drink if you sit in the living room, and hypothetically you're going to have some conversation. And so it's a bounded place, there are rules that apply, and then you get to have a little exploration inside that set of bounded rules. And if you're open, you're going to discuss all sorts of things, and if you're conservative and closed, then you're going to discuss a very, very small subset of things. And so hopefully everyone will agree on that. So that's one form of binding. Then another is, well, we put boxes around each other when it comes to groups. And so this is I think this is a picture from the Democratic convention when Obama was elected, if I remember correctly. But anyways, what happens is that people segregate themselves into little microgroups like Democrats and Republicans, and they basically do that on a temperamental grounds, right, fundamentally. And then they produce these games that everyone knows how to play, and that's another form of simplification. So when you bring all these people together at a political convention, it's not like they all have the same ideas. They don't. And it could degenerate into chaos, and sometimes that happens. You get big demonstrations at these places, and sometimes people throw tear gas and all of that. But mostly speaking, it's pretty peaceful. And the reason for that is that there's a set of procedures in place that have some historical justification, that are embedded within a shared cultural and belief system. And everybody goes there and agrees to play by the rules, roughly speaking. And so then they can elect a candidate. They can kind of flip it down to a binary choice for the election, right? Yes or no, something like that. And nobody gets killed, usually. So hooray for that. That's a hell of a thing to pull off, to be able to generate out of 300 million people, 2 people to run for the highest office, then let everyone play a game to determine who they're going to be, and then to have the bloody thing function stably through power transitions. Like, that never happens, right? That's a complete bloody miracle, and hardly any societies have ever pulled it off. The power transition being the really important thing. Because a tyrant can be stable for a while, but usually what happens is he dies and all hell breaks loose. So I think it was George Washington that said, or had said about him, the reason that he was a great leader wasn't because he was president, but because he stopped being president. And that's really worth thinking about. So then, the next thing that sort of simplifies your world is actually your physiological structure, right? And we talked about that a little bit. Well, you can only see things that are in front of you, not things that are to the side or behind you. you know, you can only see a very narrow you can only see a very narrow chunk of the electromagnetic spectrum, roughly that chunk that enables you to see by sunlight and to detect ripe fruit and that sort of thing. So it's very evolutionarily determined. And you see things of a certain size quite easily because they're handy, right? So objects manifest themselves to you as things because they have some relationship to your capacity to use them as tools, and that's dependent on your size. You have a certain strength and not a different strength. You have a certain degree of articulation. There's some things you can represent in language. So you have limitations that screen out from your consideration all sorts of things. And that's bad because, for example, before people discovered germs, there was a lot of them zipping about killing people, and the fact that we couldn't see them wasn't such a good thing. But by the same token, we're also not as overwhelmed with complexity as we might be if we could detect everything. And you know, one of the problems with being connected so much is that it's easy to drown in information. And that's rough for information foragers. You can't stay off your damn computer because there's, you know, it opens up your senses far beyond their normal limitations. And so where should you stop? Well, you don't. You know, you're on the damn thing like a pensioner on a slot machine, and for many of the same reasons. So your body also filters out the world for you and provides you with access to some information and not access to others. And then the same thing is the case with your nervous system. And I put the first picture there of this is the central nervous system that controls voluntary movement, for example. I put it there because people like to think that their brain is in their head, but it's a stupid way of thinking about it as far as I'm concerned, because you have an awful lot of neurological tissue distributed through your body, and like your autonomic nervous system, if I remember correctly, which is mostly distributed through your body, has more neurons in it than your central nervous system. And so you aren't a brain in a body, you know. Your brain is really distributed through your whole body. And I think the idea that you have a brain in a body is kind of a holdover from the idea that you have a soul in a body. And not that I'm necessarily criticizing that idea, but I think they kind of got grafted onto one another. And so, but the problem with that is that so it's the soul body, brain body, mind body dichotomy, which I think is the same dichotomy. And the problem with that is that it's easy to think of thought as something that's abstracted away from the body. And I think that was an Enlightenment idea, you know, that just like the soul shouldn't be contaminated by the demands of the body if you were going to be pure spiritually, so your thought shouldn't be contaminated by your subjectivity and your emotions and your motivations and all of that. Your abstractions should be independent of your subjectivity. And rationality and emotion are construed in that manner as enemies. You know, that the purpose of rationality is to dispense with the irrationality of emotion and motivation. And that's Freud's idea of the properly functioning ego is something like that too, because the id is this place of compulsion and drive, and the ego has to basically suppress that in the service of the superego. There's no idea of integration, really, in Freud. Now, I don't want to be rough on Freud, and I think part of the reason that he thought that way is because the patients he had were precisely those who weren't very well integrated because of their pathological past, and so they didn't know how to get those subsystems up into the overarching game, and so their only alternative was something like suppression or repression. Because if you don't know how to be aggressive in a sophisticated way, you're still going to be aggressive, but you're going to have to inhibit it, control yourself, because you can't just be aggressive around people. It just won't go well for you. So even if you can't do it in a sophisticated way, you're going to repress it, or you're going to get in trouble. Those are the options. So, okay, but if you start thinking about the brain, the nervous system as part of the body, as an inseparable part, well then the function of thinking starts to become something different. It's not so much the objective, abstract representation of the world, which is kind of what you're pursuing if you're a scientist. It's more like